right, welcome back, friends. So last time we left off, I had finished sanding the deck. I started out with 60 grit, then I went to 80, then 120, and then 220. And that gave me a really smooth, glassy surface. Now, the wood we're working with, chestnut, is not really super hard and is not highly resistant to impact like some materials like oak or maple would be, but because of the aesthetic properties of this material, chestnut, I chose to use it. But because I had concerns about it being too soft, I went ahead and took a product which is made by Minwax that's called wood hardener, which is typically used for the repair of rotten wood. So on window frames or window sills that are outside, if the paint wore off and it was exposed to the elements, that wood starts to degrade rapidly and it becomes really soft and it starts to break down. And that's not considered a stable surface for painting and for applying something like a wood putty to fill in the areas that are missing and make that surface smooth and continuous. So that's what this product is for. So it's used by painters to come in, touch up that material, make it harder by soaking this wood hardener into the fibers of the wood. So I thought, why not try an unconventional application of that product, which is to use it to coat the entire surface of a piece of wood and just see, what the results are. And because it's really not a finishing product like a urethane or a lacquer or a varnish, which lend themselves towards laying down a nice smooth glassy surface, because this is not designed to do that, you end up with a lot of little anomalies like these air bubbles that you can see that have pocketed on the surface, or some ripples or waves in the material. So our next move is going to be to sand that back, but now we're going to go with a really ultra fine sandpaper, somewhere probably around 400 grit, just to smooth this surface out and knock that down. Now, again, this is not designed for this application, so sometimes when we use things in a way that they're not intended to be used, it can result in poor outcomes, or sometimes it can result in a pleasant surprise. And the pleasant surprise in this case is that it actually caused the grain of the wood to lift up, to swell up, which has given it a lot of really interesting texture. So the wavy pattern of the grain actually has some contour to it now, or some texture where it's raised up along these areas of that soft growth of the material, which occurs during the spring and summer growth period of a tree, as opposed to these narrow bands of denser growth that occur during the fall and winter. So that fact that it raised up the grain would generally be considered to be objectionable when it comes to fine woodworking, but in this case, I really like it because it's giving texture to the surface and sort of amplifying the characteristics of that grain. So I like it. So I also want to put a finish coat on this after I'm done sanding this back. So I contacted the manufacturer. I tried to email them, but my emails kept getting bounced, so I called them up and was on hold for maybe 10 minutes, but got to talk to a technical engineer that specifically works with these products. So I asked him some questions about the way that I was using it, and he was intrigued by the idea of using it in this way. But I also asked him about what would be appropriate top coats that I could put on this to glass it out, like a lacquer or urethane, and he couldn't recommend using any of those finishes because the solvent that you find in clear coats like urethanes and varnishes and lacquers would cause the liquefying of this material, and those two would mix together, and so it wouldn't be a good fit, or there would not be good compatibility between those two. But he did recommend using paste wax, which is a finish that I like a lot. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand this back till I get to that nice smooth surface. And I'm going to sand it back using a sanding pad that has a spongy surface so that it can kind of follow the anomalies in the grain of that wood. And to further facilitate that sanding, because it's going to be really small particulate, I'm going to turn to a type of sandpaper that we've not talked about so far. So all of the other abrasives that we've discussed for this project have been done dry with by hand or with a sanding tool. And this was all done with a sanding tool called a random orbital sander. And we can go into more detail about the specifics of those things like random orbital sanders and different simple tools for sanding. But I'm going to use this a different type of paper now for this last coat, which is a kind of paper that can be used wet, right? So most conventional sandpapers, if you wet them, it compromises the glue that holds the abrasive media, aluminum oxide being the most common for most sandpapers. It causes it to just slough off of the surface. But this particular type of sandpaper is intended for wet or dry applications, and so it has a water-resistant adhesive that's holding this abrasive material on the surface. And this abrasive material is particularly effective at working with finishes like lacquers and enamels, and it should work well for this wood hardening treatment as well. We'll see how it goes, but I'll be sanding this with water, and that water is going to help it cut the material more efficiently, wash away the particles that would tend to load up in the sandpaper with dry sanding. And the other bonus about wet sanding is that it's going to keep the dust down as well. Now, ordinarily, you don't want to introduce water to wood, but because it has been thoroughly saturated with this surface, I'm not concerned about it, the moisture having an adverse effect on the wood. So I'm going to get to wet sanding this off camera, and then we'll come back and look at how that quality of the surface has changed. But just as one other side note, because I wanted to knock out both sides simultaneously, what I did is I started out on my bottom side, and I went ahead and coated the bottom side, and then dropped these screws through, which sit a little high on the surface, and then rotated it by holding onto these screws, set it up on these little blocks so that it's not touching that the wet wood hardener on the other surface, so that could dry and not be sticking to anything because it's standing up on the heads of the screws on the other side as I went ahead and applied it to the top surface. So next stop, wet sanding. All right, I wet sanded that deck back with the 400 grit, and it really took off all those little imperfections on the surface. But you'll also notice that it's now what we call deglossed. So that wood hardener is still deep in the fibers of this material and doing what we needed to do, but that amount that was on the surface that we saw as a shiny reflective surface is now been sanded away, and the surface is smooth and continuous. I should have talked about this earlier, but now, better now than not at all. It's really important to understand that a lot of the things that we're working with, like this wood hardener, and next in line is going to be this paste wax, almost all these things involve the use of what are generically referred to as solvents, which are chemicals like mineral spirits, turpentine, xylene, acetone, and other ketones. And all of these things have serious health hazards associated with them. So we always want to make sure we've got appropriate barrier gloves on. That's going to be nitrile gloves when we're working with stuff like this. And that we have appropriate respiratory protection and splash protection for our eyes. So that respiratory protection needs to be scaled for the conditions in which you're using this. So I'm working in my studio where I have a heavy-duty exhaust fan that's pulling air away from me, which is minimizing the ppm or parts per million of that contaminant in the air. So it's really about how concentrated these things are in the air. So if you're working in an enclosed space, then you have to have a heavy-duty respirator on. If you're working outside and there's a good ventilation, there may be very minimal requirements. So anyway, along with issues or concerns, in particular with this wood filler, is that these solvents that I talked about are used to thin or dissolve the rest of the components, like the plasticizers that it's delivering or the resins it's delivering to harden that material. And the idea is that it thins it enough that it allows it to absorb into the material, and then that solvent evaporates away and just leaves that material behind, right? So that is, it's flashing off the surface, it's evaporating away, and depending on the saturation levels and the type of finish, that translates into what is, in essence, drying time, right? And with some stuff like this wood hardener, like, it is really thick with ketones, and so not only does the vapor present a respiratory hazard, it also has a risk of flash fire occurring should it be in levels that were concentrated enough for it to ignite. And that could happen because you've got an ignition source close by. It could be a pilot light on a water heater or on an oven or something like that. And I can tell you from my own experience, that one time I was spraying a urethane finish onto a small little wood object on my back porch while the dryer inside of the house was running, and those fumes migrated right up through the dryer and shot flame out through the exhaust of the dryer, which fortunately it was the ductwork was aluminum and not plastic, because it would have melted that plastic instantly. So this risk of ignition is for real. So best work outside, always have the barrier gloves, make sure you got appropriate respiratory protection, good positive ventilation, so that fan is pulling away from you instead of pulling fumes up and past you. So read those product advisories. It's pretty serious business. Anyway, so let's move on to our top coat, which is paste wax. And I love paste wax as a traditional finish for wood, but it is kind of high maintenance in that paste wax usually needs to be reapplied what we would consider to be pretty frequently by today's standards. Once a month or so. People used to wax their furniture, right? And again, it depends on what kind of conditions it's exposed to, but it's a pretty durable finish actually. So again, always read your directions. Here it talks about these aliphatic hydrocarbons as being something that is off-gassed by this particular material. So again, we want to make sure that we're following all best practices, like with the wood conditioner, eye protection, respiratory protection, and a barrier for our hands so that we're not absorbing that. It is one of the same things that allows that solvent to take those chemicals and absorb them in fibers of the wood, also facilitates the absorption of those chemicals through your skin. So not only is something like acetone like guaranteed to eat your liver, but it's really good at carrying other things into your bloodstream along with it, you know. And again, I'm not a doctor, and this is not medical advice, but this is my understanding of some of the risks that are associated with this. Anyway, so it says, Minwax Paste Finishing Wax protects and adds hand-rubbed luster to any finished wood surface. Recommended for furniture, antiques, woodwork, cabinet doors, paneling, and accessories that do not need a hard protective coating of polyurethane. We're about 5 coats of wax into finishing the surface of this deck. So last time we left off, I had sanded back the wood hardener and deglossed it and taken some of the little anomalies off the surface, those little bubbles and bumps. I then put down a coat of paste wax, allowed the solvent to flash off so that it hardened. That usually takes about 10 to 15 minutes. Then buffed it with a soft cloth, and then repeated that process about 5 more times, each time buffing that surface in between. And what you see developing now is a really nice reflective surface that is really starting to show off that grain, and so I'm very excited about how this is working out. I'd like to thank you guys for joining me on this project, and really look forward to getting all of the rest of the parts in next week so that we can finish our salvage skateboard project and move on to what's next. Thanks again for supporting what I do here on my channel, and stay tuned for the release of our next module, which will be coming out next Friday.